Nobody ever expects to become a believer in something they've always dismissed as folklore and superstition. Growing up in suburban Massachusetts, surrounded by the predictable geometry of strip malls and subdivisions, I heard plenty of stories about mysterious creatures lurking in the dense forests of New England. These were tales whispered around summer camp bonfires about enormous beasts that walked upright through the pine woods, leaving massive footprints and broken branches in their wake. My friends and I would laugh about these stories, making jokes about the blurry photographs taken by people with shaking hands, about individuals who claimed to have seen impossible things in the woods but somehow never managed to capture clear evidence. I was always the skeptic in any group, the one who'd explain away every strange sound in the woods with rational explanations rooted in biology and physics. That owl call that sounded almost human, almost like someone crying out in distress. Just an owl with an unusual vocal pattern, nothing supernatural about it. Those massive tracks in the mud that seemed too large to belong to any known animal. Obviously a bear, the prints distorted and enlarged by rain and erosion. The broken branches 8 feet off the ground that local folklore attributed to territorial markers left by forest giants. Wind damage. Nothing more, or maybe a bear reaching up to get at something perfectly explainable. I chalked it all up to imagination and too much. Time in the wilderness making people see things that weren't there. Pattern recognition running wild in an environment our brains weren't evolved to fully understand. Our minds are wired to see faces in clouds, to find meaning in randomness, to create stories that explain the unexplainable. That's all these sightings were, I was convinced. Just our pattern-seeking brains working overtime in an environment full of shadows and ambiguity. That skepticism, that absolute certainty in the impossibility of these legends, that confidence in my rational worldview lasted until last spring, when something happened in the woods of northern Maine that fundamentally altered my understanding of what's possible in this world. That shattered my comfortable certainty and replaced it with wonder and confusion in equal measure. What I'm about to share with you isn't embellished for dramatic effect or fictional entertainment. I'm not trying to sell you anything or convince you of some agenda. Every detail is exactly as it occurred, no exaggeration, no artistic license. And even though nearly a year has passed since that initial encounter, I still find myself sometimes lying awake at night questioning whether it was all real, whether I actually experienced what I remember experiencing, despite the ongoing evidence that proves beyond any doubt that it was real, that it continues to be real. But the evidence is there, undeniable and constant, reminding me daily that the world is stranger and more mysterious than I ever imagined, that there are things walking this earth that science hasn't catalogued. Creatures that exist in the blind spots of human knowledge. After my marriage fell apart 3 years ago, a dissolution that was both inevitable and devastating, I needed to escape the suffocating familiarity of city life, needed to get away from the apartment where every corner held memories of better times, away from the friends who didn't know whether to offer sympathy or avoid the subject entirely, away from the routine that had once provided comfort but now felt like a prison. My grandmother had owned a small hunting lodge in the backwoods of Maine, a property she'd inherited from her father, who'd built it in the 1940s as a place to escape civilization and chase deer through the autumn woods. The lodge sits about 55 miles from the nearest actual town, if you can call a collection of 300 people, one general store, and a post office a town. When my grandmother died, she left the property to me, probably figuring I was the only one in the family crazy enough or desperate enough to actually use the place, to appreciate what she'd always called the blessing of true solitude. My siblings wanted no part of it, thought the place was a money pit in the middle of nowhere, suggested we sell it to some developer who'd turn it into a hunting resort for wealthy tourists. But I couldn't let that happen, couldn't let the place my grandmother loved become something commercial and artificial. The lodge sits in a valley, surrounded by thick stands of white pine and hemlock, completely isolated from civilization in a way that's hard to find anymore in this interconnected world. There are no power lines running out this far, no telephone poles, no evidence of human infrastructure beyond the lodge itself, and the barely maintained logging road that provides the only access. My closest neighbor, if you can call him that, lives roughly 10 miles away down that logging road, a road that's barely passable half the year when mud season turns it into a quagmire or winter snow drifts close it entirely. He's an older gentleman named Frank who keeps to himself and respects others doing the same, perfect as far as neighbors go. We wave when we pass each other in town every few weeks, exchange a few words about weather and wildlife, and that's the extent of our interaction. The isolation was exactly what I needed when I moved out here permanently. I craved silence, craved space, craved the absence of human complication and drama. In the city, I'd been surrounded by people but felt utterly alone. Out here, actually alone, I paradoxically felt more connected to something, though I couldn't have articulated what that something was at the time. The lodge itself is modest in every way, essentially a single large room with a sleeping loft, accessed by a steep ladder, a kitchen area that's barely more than a propane-powered camp stove, and a sink with a manual pump that draws water from a well, and a massive stone fireplace that provides the only heat during the brutal Maine winters when temperatures regularly drop below zero and snow accumulates in drifts taller than a man. There's no cell service out here, no internet connection, except for a satellite system I could have installed but chose not to, just the constant whisper of wind through the trees and the occasional cry of a loon from the lake 3 miles north. At night, the silence is so profound it's almost oppressive if you're not used to it, broken only by the sounds of nocturnal animals going about their business, the hoot of owls, the yipping of distant coyotes, the rustling of smaller creatures in the underbrush. I make my living through a combination of odd jobs in town when I need cash for supplies I can't produce myself. Things like flour and coffee and fuel for the generator I run a few hours each day, and wild crafting, which is a fancy term for harvesting plants, mushrooms, and other materials from the forest to sell to herbal suppliers and specialty food distributors. My grandmother taught me the skill when I was young, taking me on long walks through the woods during summer vacations, showing me which plants had value either as food or medicine, which mushrooms were safe to eat and which would kill you, how to read the subtle signs that indicated where rare herbs might grow. At the time, I thought it was just a grandmother sharing her hobbies. With a grandchild, passing time during long summer days, I never imagined it would become the primary source of my income decades later. After I moved to the lodge permanently, that childhood education became my economic foundation. Some weeks, I'd spend 5 or 6 days out in the forest, hiking miles with my collection bags and field guides, gathering whatever the season offered. Wild leeks in early spring, fiddlehead ferns in late April, numerous mushroom varieties throughout summer and fall. The work kept me fed and gave me purpose, a reason to be out in the forest every day, paying attention to the subtle changes in the ecosystem. The day everything changed was in late April, right at that perfect moment when winter finally releases its iron grip, but before the black flies emerge to make the woods unbearable. The birch trees were just beginning to leaf out, their bare branches now sporting that particular shade of yellow-green that signals new growth, and the forest floor was carpeted with spring wildflowers. I'd packed my usual supplies that morning: canvas bags, my harvesting knife, a canteen, some dried venison, and a topographical map, and headed out around 8 in the morning to check a location about 4 miles west of the lodge where I knew a good population of ramps grew. Ramps, also called wild leeks, were one of the first valuable crops of spring, their garlicky flavor prized by chefs. The hike was gorgeous in that way unique to spring mornings in the northern forest. Everything smelled fresh and alive after months of frozen dormancy, the earth exhaling with relief. I could hear spring peepers calling from every vernal pool, a sound that always made me happy because it meant winter was truly over. The morning sun created those perfect diagonal beams through the canopy that photographers chase and never quite capture. I reached the ramp patch around 10 and spent a solid 90 minutes carefully harvesting, making sure to take only the larger plants and leave plenty behind to reseed. My bags were getting pleasantly heavy when I decided to explore a bit further west, into a section of forest I'd never thoroughly investigated. That's when I heard something that immediately triggered every primitive alarm in my brain, activated instincts that trace back thousands of generations. It wasn't a sound that belonged in these woods, nothing like the calls of birds or the rustling of small mammals, or even the occasional grunt of a bear. At first, I thought maybe it was wind moving through a hollow tree, but when I stopped walking and really listened, I realized the air was completely still. Then I considered that maybe I was hearing a wounded deer, but this was different, deeper, more labored. It was breathing, I realized with a sudden chill, heavy and rattling and desperate, the kind of gasping that indicates severe distress or injury. The sound had a rhythmic quality to it, in and out, each exhalation seeming to cost enormous effort. Every rational part of my brain was telling me to turn around and head back to the lodge. In the wilderness, strange sounds usually mean danger. But I've always had this compulsive need to investigate, especially when it involves suffering. I set my bags down carefully and moved toward the sound, trying to step quietly on the soft forest floor. The breathing grew louder as I approached a small depression in the terrain, a natural bowl maybe 40 feet across, surrounded by thick stands of young hemlock. When I pushed through the last screen of branches and saw what was making that sound, my entire body locked up. For several seconds, time seemed to stop completely as I literally couldn't process the information my eyes were sending to my brain. The creature was enormous, easily 9 feet tall, even lying down as it was, propped against a massive boulder. It was covered entirely in thick fur that looked almost reddish-brown in the dappled sunlight, long and somewhat matted. But what struck me most forcefully was how human the proportions were. The torso was broad and muscular, with clearly defined shoulders and a chest that rose and fell with that labored breathing. The arms were long but not grotesquely so, ending in hands that were clearly hands, not paws, with distinct fingers and opposable thumbs. The face was something between human and ape, with a prominent brow ridge that cast shadows over the eyes, a flat nose with flared nostrils, and a mouth that seemed capable of much more expression than any normal animal. The creature's eyes were what really got me, what made the initial shock give way to something else, something more complex than simple fear. They were large and dark, almost black, but with an unmistakable intelligence behind them. These weren't the eyes of an animal operating on pure instinct. These were eyes that thought, that evaluated, that understood. And more than intelligence, I saw emotion in those eyes. Pain that was physical and immediate, exhaustion that went bone deep, and a fear of death that was approaching inexorably. The creature was watching me with those eyes, and I could see the calculation happening in real time, the assessment of whether I represented a threat or, possibly, desperately, some kind of help. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity. During that frozen moment, I noticed more details. The creature's right leg was extended at an unnatural angle, bent in a way that legs shouldn't bend, clearly badly injured. The fur around the lower part of the leg was darker than the rest, matted with what had to be dried blood. There was visible swelling even through the thick fur. The creature's breathing was labored, and I could see the ribcage showing through the fur, a sign of serious malnourishment. This creature, whatever it was in the process of dying. The creature made a sound then, and it's that sound that I hear sometimes in my dreams. It wasn't aggressive or threatening. It was something closer to a whimper, a vocalization of pain and desperation that communicated suffering in a way that transcended species. It tried to shift its position, and I saw the visible wince, the shudder that ran through its entire massive frame. In that instant, all my fear evaporated completely, replaced by something more powerful, empathy that overrode every survival instinct. This wasn't a monster or a threat. This was a living being in agony. I thought about the dried venison in my pack, moving very slowly and deliberately, keeping my eyes on the creature the whole time. I reached into my pack and pulled out a strip. The creature's reaction was immediate and powerful. Its nostrils flared dramatically, head lifting slightly. It could smell the food, and the intensity of its response told me everything I needed to know about how hungry it was. I took one piece of venison and tossed it gently, not directly toward the creature, but about halfway between us. The strip landed on a patch of moss. Those dark eyes tracked the food, locked onto it with an intensity that was almost painful to witness. Then it reached out with one of those massive hands, fingers stretching toward the venison. The hand was huge, with thick, leathery pads on the palm and fingertips. The creature grabbed the venison and brought it to its mouth, practically inhaling the strip. I threw another piece, this one landing a bit closer. It snatched this one up just as quickly. I threw a third piece, then a fourth, watching as the creature devoured each strip. With every piece, I took a small step forward, gradually closing the distance between us. The creature watched my movements carefully, but didn't react aggressively. I had 2 strips of venison left. Instead of throwing the next one, I held it out, arm fully extended, and took 2 more steps forward. Now I was maybe 8 feet away, close enough to see the individual hairs in its fur, close enough to smell it, which was a combination of wet earth, dried blood, and something musky, but not entirely unpleasant. The creature stared at the venison in my hand, then at my face. Hunger won. The creature extended one of those enormous hands, reaching toward me, and I held perfectly still. Its fingers closed around the venison with surprising gentleness, plucking the strip from my palm without touching my skin. It ate this piece more slowly, chewing deliberately. Through the entire process, it never took its eyes off my face, studying me with an intensity that felt almost uncomfortable. The creature made another vocalization, softer than before, almost like a sigh. Then it glanced down at its injured leg, back up at me, and in that moment I saw clear communication in those eyes, intention and request as obvious as if it had spoken words. It understood that it needed help, and it was asking if I could provide that help. I looked at the leg more carefully now that he was closer. The break was obvious, about halfway down the shin, with the bone clearly displaced. I've set bones before, helped my grandmother splint a neighbor's dog's leg once. The basic principle is always the same. Immobilize the break, keep it stable and straight. I looked around the depression and spotted 2 relatively straight branches, each about 3 feet long, dense hardwood that looked strong enough to serve as splints. I picked them up and showed them to the creature, holding them up alongside its injured leg without touching it, communicating my intention through gesture. The creature watched intently, and I saw understanding dawn in those dark eyes. That recognition was shocking in its implications. This creature understood medical principles that should have been beyond an animal's comprehension. The creature shifted position slightly, extending the injured leg toward me as much as it could, which must have been agonizing. That deliberate cooperation cemented my decision completely. I needed materials to bind the splint, and I used my knife to cut strips from the bottom of my shirt, sacrificing my clothing without hesitation. I knelt down next to that massive leg, my hands actually shaking, and began the process of setting the bone. The creature made sounds during this, low groans and whimpers that absolutely tore at my heart. But it didn't pull away or try to stop me. I positioned the 2 branches on either side of the break and began wrapping the fabric strips around them, binding the splint as tightly as I dared. The whole process took maybe 15 minutes, and by the end, sweat was pouring down my face. When I finished, I sat back on my heels and examined my work. It wasn't perfect, but it was solid. The splint held the leg stable. The creature looked at its leg, then at me, and made a sound that was unmistakably grateful. Then it surprised me completely by reaching out with one of those huge hands and gently, very gently touching my shoulder. The contact lasted only a second, but the meaning was absolutely clear. "Thank you." I stood up and realized I'd just used all my food. I had a 4-mile hike back to the lodge with nothing to eat, but what bothered me was leaving this creature here, still vulnerable. Recovery would take weeks at minimum. I couldn't just walk away. I held up one finger in a universal gesture of wait, then pointed at myself and then in the direction of my lodge, trying to communicate through gesture what I couldn't say with words. "Wait here. I'm going to come back." The creature watched me, and I saw comprehension in its expression. It knew I was leaving temporarily, but would return. I gathered up my bags of ramps and began the hike back to the lodge, my mind racing. What had I just done? What was that creature? Bigfoot was supposed to be a myth, but I'd just touched one, fed one, splintered its broken leg. It was real, undeniably real. Back at the lodge, I immediately started preparing supplies. I cooked up a huge pot of rice and beans, made a dozen peanut butter sandwiches, gathered some apples and carrots from my root cellar, and filled a large canteen with clean well water. I packed everything into a large backpack, along with a heavy wool blanket and some basic first aid supplies. I headed back out less than 2 hours after returning, adrenaline pushing me faster than I normally hike. I arrived back at the depression while there was still good light, and when I pushed through the hemlock screen, the creature was still there. Its head lifted immediately when I appeared, and I saw recognition in its eyes, followed by what might have been relief. I unpacked all the food I'd brought and spread it out. It ate with slightly less desperation this time, actually taking the time to chew properly. I sat down about 6 feet away and watched. It was definitely female. I could see that now in the body structure. She was magnificent, powerful, and wild. When she finished eating, she made a contented sound, a soft hooting. I pulled out the blanket I'd brought and, moving slowly, draped it over her torso. She looked at the blanket, then at me, and made another grateful sound, pulling the blanket closer. I established a routine over the following days. Every morning I'd wake up before dawn, prepare food and supplies, and hike out to the depression. She was always waiting, always seemed happy to see me in her own reserved way. I brought different foods, trying to figure out what she liked best. She seemed to appreciate cooked meat most of all, but also ate fruits enthusiastically. I started staying longer each day, sometimes sitting there for hours, just being present with her. We developed a way of communicating that transcended language, a system of gestures and vocalizations. After about a week, I noticed she was trying to put weight on the injured leg. The splint was holding well. I checked it every day, carefully unwrapping the bindings to examine the injury site, applying poultices from herbs my grandmother had taught me about. 2 weeks after the initial encounter, she was able to stand with support, using a thick branch as a crutch. I watched in amazement as she rose to her full height, towering over me by at least 2 feet. By the 3rd week, she was taking tentative steps. By the 4th, she could walk slowly without the crutch, though she still had a pronounced limp. She was healing, and I felt an overwhelming sense of accomplishment mixed with approaching loss. I realized she wasn't going to need my daily care much longer. The thought filled me with unexpected sadness. On what I thought might be one of our last days together, she did something that surprised me completely. She stood up, gestured for me to follow her, and began walking slowly out of the depression. I followed, and she took me deeper into the forest to places I'd never explored. She showed me a cave entrance hidden behind a waterfall, a massive oak tree with deep claw marks on the trunk, and a grove where wild apples grew thick. It was like she was saying, "This is my home. I want you to know it." When we returned to the depression, the sun was setting. She looked at me for a long moment, then reached out and touched my head gently, her huge hand covering my entire skull but applying no pressure. Then she made a sound I hadn't heard before, a complex vocalization that seemed to encompass gratitude and friendship and goodbye all at once. I understood then that she was going to leave. I nodded, feeling emotion tighten my throat, and said, "Take care of yourself." She hooted once, turned, and walked into the darkening forest. Except it wasn't an ending, it was a transformation. I'd find gifts left on my porch in the morning, offerings that appeared overnight, large branches of firewood neatly stacked, a pile of wild mushrooms, edible and valuable. Once I found a deer haunch, freshly killed and expertly butchered. I knew these were from her, tokens of appreciation, her way of reciprocating the care I'd shown. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of her in the forest during my foraging trips, watching me from a distance, making sure I was safe. Once, during a particularly violent thunderstorm, I looked out the window to see her there, a massive silhouette against the lightning-lit sky, checking to make sure the lodge was secure. People occasionally ask me if I ever get lonely out here. I tell them I'm content, that I like the solitude. I don't mention the real reason I never feel truly alone. I've never told anyone this story in detail. They wouldn't understand. They'd demand proof, want photographs or video evidence. But she's not a specimen to be studied. She's an individual, a sentient being with her own right to privacy and autonomy. What we have is based on mutual respect and trust, and I won't violate that sacred trust. She taught me something important. The world is stranger and more wonderful than our scientific frameworks admit, and I learned that kindness transcends species, that compassion doesn't require shared language. Just last week, I was foraging for chanterelles and heard a familiar sound from the trees behind me, that distinctive hooting call. I turned to see her standing at the edge of the clearing. She nodded toward my bag, then toward a section of the forest I hadn't explored yet. I understood immediately. She was indicating there were more chanterelles in that direction. We foraged together that afternoon, working in comfortable silence. My bags were overflowing by the time the sun started sinking. She helped me carry everything back to the lodge, set down her load carefully, made our goodbye sound, and then she was gone. I think about that day often, the day I found her broken and dying, the day that changed everything. I could have run away in fear. I could have convinced myself I'd imagined it. I could have left her there to die. But I didn't. I chose compassion over fear, and because of that, my life has become richer than I ever imagined possible. Late at night, I often sit on the lodge's porch with a cup of coffee, looking out at the dark forest. And sometimes, if I'm lucky, I'll see movement among the trees, something massive and unmistakable. She's there, just at the edge of where my porch light reaches, watching. I'll raise my cup in a silent acknowledgement, and she'll respond with a soft hoot that carries through the night air, and we'll share a moment of understanding across the darkness. This is my life now, and I wouldn't change a single thing.